Blood smeared across the rough fabric of her apron, as Clara Fletcher scrubbed another pile of miners' shirts in the freezing creek water, her cracked fingers leaving crimson streaks on everything she touched. The bitter Utah winter of 1876 showed no mercy, and neither did Mr. Thornton, who expected his laundry service to operate regardless of weather or human limitation. 20 more shirts before sundown, he had barked that morning, tossing a bundle of filth-encrusted clothing at her feet. Clara had merely nodded, knowing that arguing would cost her the meager wages that kept her and her younger brother fed. The water in her wash basin had turned a murky pink from her bleeding hands, but she couldn't afford to change it. Each bucket hauled from the creek cost her precious minutes, and Mr. Thornton docked pay for tardiness. 3 years she'd worked for him since her parents died from fever, and in that time, she'd never known kindness from the man who owned half of Marysvale. "Good Lord, woman, what are you doing?" Clara startled at the deep voice behind her, nearly dropping the shirt she was wringing out. Turning, she found herself staring up at a tall figure silhouetted against the afternoon sun. The man stepped forward, revealing a weather-beaten face beneath the brim of a dusty Stetson. His eyes, a startling shade of blue, widened as they fell to her hands. "You're bleeding all over those shirts," he said, his voice softer now. "They'll dry clean," Clara replied defensively, tucking her hands into her apron. "The blood washes out." The stranger crouched beside her, and she noticed the worn leather chaps over his denim pants, the revolver holstered at his hip, the spurs on his boots. A cowboy, passing through most likely. Marysvale saw plenty of them, working the cattle drives between the northern territories and the southern markets. "Let me see," he said, not a request but not quite a demand either. Something in his tone made her comply. She held out her hands, palms up, revealing the cracked skin split open across her knuckles and fingertips. "Christ," he muttered. "How long have you been working like this?" Clara shrugged. "It's worse in winter. The cold makes the skin crack, and you keep going anyway." There was disbelief in his voice. "I have no choice. These need to be done by sundown." The cowboy stood, his jaw tight beneath his short beard. "For whom, Mr. Thornton? He owns the laundry service, among other things. And he knows your hands are in this condition." Clara laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Mr. Thornton doesn't concern himself with such details." The stranger stared at her for a long moment. Then, without warning, he gathered up the wet shirts she'd finished and the pile of dirty ones waiting to be washed. "What are you doing?" Clara scrambled to her feet. "Sir, please, I need those. You're done," he said firmly. "I can't be done. If those shirts aren't cleaned and delivered, you're done working for anyone but yourself." His voice cut through her protests like a knife through butter. "No decent person would expect you to work until your fingers bled." Clara stared at him, speechless. The audacity of this stranger to interfere in her life, in her livelihood, no matter how miserable it might be. "You have no right. The name's Xavier Blackwell," he interrupted, shifting the laundry to one arm and extending his free hand. Then, seeing her bleeding fingers, he withdrew it with a grimace. "I just bought the Rockingham Ranch outside of town, and I'm looking to hire someone with grit to help run the place." Clara blinked at him. "A ranch hand? I don't know the first thing about ranching, Mr. Blackwell." "Xavier," he corrected. "And I need someone to cook, keep house, and help with accounts. My foreman tells me the previous owner's wife handled all that before they sold out and moved east." I can cook," Clara said cautiously. "And I'm good with figures. My father taught me." Xavier nodded. "I'll pay you double whatever Thornton's giving you plus room and board at the ranch." Clara's mind raced. It sounded too good to be true, and in her experience, things that sounded that way usually were. Why would you offer a job to a stranger? Because anyone who works until their fingers bleed has the kind of determination I need. His eyes softened. And because I can't in good conscience leave you here to continue this. Clara hesitated. She had responsibilities in town, her brother for one. I have a younger brother. He's 16. I can't leave him. Bring him. I could use a strong young man around the place too. Clara stared at this man who had appeared from nowhere with an offer that could change everything. Mr. Thornton won't like it. He doesn't take kindly to losing his workers. Xavier's mouth curved into a hard smile. Let me worry about Thornton. He set down the laundry and pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket. Now, let's get those hands wrapped up before you lose any more blood. Clara allowed him to gently bind her hands, watching his face as he concentrated on the task. His hands were calloused but gentle, his movements careful not to cause her more pain. Why are you really doing this? She asked quietly. Xavier met her eyes, and something in his gaze made her breath catch. Because my mother worked herself to death for a man who didn't value her. And I swore I'd never stand by and watch it happen to anyone else. In that moment, standing by the creek with her hands cradled in those of a stranger, Clara Fletcher felt the first stirring of something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. The walk to her small, rented room on the edge of Marysvale was tense with anticipation. Xavier insisted on carrying the laundry, though Clara protested it wasn't proper for a man of his standing to be seen doing a washerwoman's work. I've mucked stalls and branded cattle, he replied with a shrug. A man's dignity doesn't wash off that easy. Clara's brother, Daniel, was mending a fence for their elderly neighbor when they arrived. He straightened at the sight of the tall cowboy walking beside his sister, his young face immediately suspicious. "Danny," Clara called. "Come meet Mr. Blackwell. He's just bought the rocking M." Daniel approached cautiously, wiping his hands on his trousers before extending one to Xavier. "Sir," Xavier shifted the laundry to shake the boy's hand. "Xavier Blackwell, your sister tells me you're 16 and capable." "Yes, sir." Daniel glanced at Clara, questions in his eyes. "Mr. Blackwell has offered us positions at his ranch," Clara explained. "Both of us." Daniel's eyebrows shot up. "Positions doing what? Your sister will keep house and handle the books." "You'll learn ranching from the ground up if you're interested. Hard work but honest, and you'll earn your own wage." Daniel looked between them, caution warring with excitement on his young face. "What about Mr. Thornton?" Clara's contracted to him. "Not anymore," Xavier said firmly. "I'm settling that matter this afternoon." Clara led them into the small two-room dwelling she and Daniel had called home since their parents' death. It was sparse but clean, with a small stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a curtain dividing the sleeping area from the main room. "It's not much," she said, suddenly self-conscious of their poverty. "It's tidy," Xavier replied, setting the laundry on the table. "Pack what you need. I'll send a wagon for your furniture tomorrow." "We don't own the furniture," Clara admitted. "Just our clothes, some books, and our mother's china." Something flickered in Xavier's eyes, not pity but understanding. "All the more reason to start fresh. I'll return in 2 hours after I've spoken with Thornton." "He won't let me go easily," Clara warned. "I owe him for rent." "How much?" Clara named a sum that represented nearly 2 months of her wages. Xavier didn't flinch, merely nodded. "Consider it an advance on your salary. I'll settle it with him." After Xavier left, Daniel turned to his sister, his young face serious beyond his years. "Clara, are you sure about this?" "We don't know him." Clara looked down at her bandaged hands. "I know he's the first person in 3 years to notice I was bleeding and actually care. That counts for something." "What if he expects other things from you?" Daniel asked awkwardly. Clara had considered this. A single woman accepting a position in a bachelor's household invited speculation. He seems honorable, and we'll be together. If anything seems amiss, we'll leave." Daniel nodded slowly. "I suppose it can't be worse than watching you work yourself to death for Thornton." They packed their meager belongings, quickly: clothes, a few cherished books, their father's pocket watch, and the carefully wrapped china that had been their mother's pride. Everything fit into 2 small trunks and a crate. As promised, Xavier returned 2 hours later. His expression was grim, but he managed a smile when Clara opened the door. "It's settled," he said. "Your debt to Thornton is paid. You're free to leave Marysvale." Relief washed over Clara, followed by wariness. He agreed that easily. Xavier's smile turned wolfish. "I wouldn't say easily, but he agreed." "Are you ready?" A wagon waited outside, driven by a weathered man with a silver mustache who introduced himself as Hank, the ranch foreman. He helped load their belongings, eyeing Clara and Daniel with frank curiosity. "So you're our new housekeeper," he said to Clara. "About time. I've been trying to cook for 6 men. It's a disaster." "6 men?" Clara asked, suddenly nervous about being so outnumbered. "Me, Xavier, and 4 ranch hands," Hank explained. "Good men, all of them, though they eat like wolves." The journey to the Rocking M took nearly an hour, following a winding road that led west out of Marysvale into rolling hills dotted with sage and juniper. Xavier rode alongside the wagon on a magnificent chestnut stallion, occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing bits of information about the property. 5,000 acres, he told them. Good grazing land, 2 creeks that run year-round, and the previous owner built a solid house. It needs a woman's touch, but it's sound. As they crested a hill, the ranch came into view. A large 2-story house stood in a sheltered valley, surrounded by outbuildings, corrals, and a barn. Smoke curled from the chimney, and even from a distance, Clara could see it was far grander than anything she'd ever lived in. "That's where we'll be living?" Daniel asked, unable to hide his awe. "The main house, yes," Xavier confirmed. "Clara, you'll have your own room." "Daniel, you'll bunk with the hands until I can get another room added to the house." Clara's throat tightened. Her own room. After years of sharing a curtained-off corner with Daniel, the luxury of privacy seemed almost unimaginable. As they pulled into the yard, 4 men emerged from the barn, curiously eyeing the new arrivals. Xavier made quick introductions: Tom and Illy, brothers from Colorado; Joe, a former cavalry scout; and Miguel, who'd worked the ranch for the previous owner. "Miss Fletcher will be keeping house and managing the accounts," Xavier announced. "Her brother Daniel will be learning the trade. I expect you to treat them with respect." The men nodded, though Clara caught curious glances exchanged between them. A woman and a boy at a ranch of rough men would naturally cause speculation. Xavier led them into the house. The interior was spacious but neglected: dusty furniture, empty shelves, and a kitchen with dirty dishes piled in the sink. "As I said, it needs attention," Xavier admitted. The previous owners left rather hastily. Clara surveyed the space, mentally calculating the work ahead. It was daunting, but after years of backbreaking laundry work, managing a household seemed almost a relief. "I'll start with the kitchen," she said decisively. Xavier smiled, and for the first time since their meeting, Clara noticed the small crinkles around his eyes when he did so. It transformed his face from merely handsome to something that made her heart skip. "I knew you were the right choice," he said. "Get settled in, both of you." "Dinner's at 6, though I should warn you, it's Hank's turn to cook, which means beans and salt pork." "I could cook," Clara offered, "if the pantry is stocked." "You've had a long day and your hands are fine," Clara interrupted, unwrapping the bandages to reveal her cracked skin. "Cooking won't hurt them like laundry did." Xavier hesitated, then nodded. "The pantry's through there. Use whatever you find. I'm not particular." After he left to tend to ranch business, Clara and Daniel explored their new home. The house was solidly built with 6 bedrooms upstairs, a large kitchen, dining room, parlor, and Xavier's office downstairs. Clara's assigned room overlooked the eastern hills, with a real bed and a small vanity. "This is bigger than our whole place in town," Daniel marveled, running his hand over the patchwork quilt on the bed. Clara nodded, overwhelmed by the sudden change in their fortunes. "It doesn't seem real." "You trust him?" Daniel asked quietly. Clara considered the question. Xavier Blackwell had swept into their lives like a character from one of her dime novels, the mysterious stranger with a heart of gold. Yet there was something genuine in his indignation over her bleeding hands, something sincere in his offer. "I think I do," she finally answered. "But we'll be careful all the same." That evening, Clara prepared a simple but hearty meal from the staples in the pantry: chicken stew, biscuits, and apple cobbler for dessert. The men devoured it like they hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks, which, judging by the state of the kitchen, they likely hadn't. "Miss Fletcher," Hank said, wiping his mouth with a napkin, "if the boss doesn't pay you what you're worth, there'll be a mutiny." The other men laughed and nodded in agreement. Xavier, seated at the head of the table, watched Clara with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Miss Fletcher will be compensated fairly for all her work," he said, "and addressed properly as our housekeeper, not as a servant." "Clara is fine," she insisted, uncomfortable with formality. "Clara, then." Xavier smiled that transformative smile again. "And you must call me Xavier, not Mr. Blackwell or boss." Clara nodded, feeling a flush creep up her neck at the familiar address. In Marysvale, such informality between employer and employee would raise eyebrows, especially between a man and woman. But the ranch seemed to operate by different rules. After dinner, while the men sat smoking on the porch, Clara cleaned the kitchen with Daniel's help, marveling at the difference a few hours had made in their lives. "You think it will last?" Daniel asked softly, drying a plate. Clara glanced out the window at Xavier's silhouette against the evening sky. "I don't know," she admitted. "But for now we have a roof, food, and fair wages. That's more than we had this morning." As the days passed, Clara settled into a routine at the Rockingham. She rose before dawn to prepare breakfast for the men, spent mornings cleaning and organizing the neglected house, afternoons baking or preserving, and evenings managing the ranch accounts, which had been in disarray when Xavier purchased the property. Daniel took to ranch life with enthusiasm, soaking up knowledge from the older hands and proving himself capable despite his youth. Clara watched with pride as her little brother grew stronger and more confident, no longer the haunted boy who'd helped her hang laundry after school. Xavier was often away, riding the boundaries of his property or visiting neighboring ranches to establish connections. When present, he treated Clara with a polite deference that confused her. There were moments when she caught him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch, but he maintained a careful distance, never venturing into impropriety. A month into their new life, Clara was hanging sheets on the line behind the house when Xavier appeared, leading his horse. "Those hands healing up?" he asked, nodding toward her fingers. Clara glanced down. The cracks had closed, leaving only faint red lines. "Much better, thank you." "Good." He hesitated, shifting his weight. "I'm riding into town for supplies. Anything you need." Clara mentally reviewed her pantry. "Flour, sugar, and perhaps some spices if you can get them." The kitchen was poorly stocked. Xavier nodded. "Make a list. I'll get whatever you need." Clara hurried inside to jot down items, returning with the paper to find Xavier checking his saddle cinch. "Here you are. Though I should warn you, Mr. Thornton owns the general store. He may not be eager to serve you after everything. Xavier's expression hardened. Thornton and I have an understanding. He won't give me trouble. Clara wanted to ask what kind of understanding could tame a man like Edgar Thornton, but Xavier was already mounting his horse. I should be back by nightfall. She watched him ride away, his straight back and broad shoulders cutting an impressive figure against the blue sky. There was so much she didn't know about Xavier Blackwell, where he came from, how he acquired the money to buy the Rocking M, why he'd chosen this remote corner of Utah to settle. That evening, Xavier returned as promised, his saddlebags bulging with supplies. To Clara's surprise, he'd acquired not only the staples she'd requested, but also fabric for new curtains, a set of hairpins she'd mentioned wanting weeks ago in passing conversation, and a small box of candied ginger, a luxury she hadn't tasted since her mother's death. "You remembered the ginger," she said softly, turning the small package in her hands. Xavier shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. "You mentioned your mother used to make tea with it when you were ill." The fact that he'd recalled such a small detail touched Clara deeply. "Thank you." That was thoughtful. Their eyes met, and for a moment, something electric passed between them. Then Xavier cleared his throat and stepped back. "I should unsaddle my horse." He was gone before Clara could respond, leaving her confused by the moment they'd shared and his abrupt departure. Later that night, after the house had quieted, Clara sat at the kitchen table working on the ranch accounts by lamplight. The sound of boots on the porch alerted her to Xavier's presence before he entered, stopping short at the sight of her. "You're still up," he observed. Clara gestured to the ledgers spread before her. These books needed attention. The previous owner was creative with his record keeping. Xavier chuckled, pouring himself a cup of coffee from the pot she kept warm on the stove. "That's a diplomatic way of saying he was a cheat." "I wouldn't presume." "You can presume," Xavier interrupted, taking a seat across from her. "James Morton was cooking these books for years. That's why I got the ranch for half what it's worth." Clara's eyebrows rose. "You knew the accounts were falsified when you bought the property." Xavier nodded, sipping his coffee. "I had a friend at the bank in Salt Lake City review the financials. Morton was hiding debt, underreporting cattle losses. The ranch is sound, but the books weren't. That explains the discrepancies I've been finding." Clara tapped her pencil against the ledger. "With proper management, this operation could be quite profitable." Xavier studied her across the table, his blue eyes thoughtful. "You have a head for business." "My father was a shopkeeper before he died. He taught me bookkeeping." "Yet you ended up washing laundry." Clara's expression clouded. "Marysvale has limited opportunities for a woman alone. Mr. Thornton offered what seemed like steady work at the time, and then trapped you with debt." Xavier's voice hardened. "A common enough tactic." Clara looked up, curious. "You seem to know a lot about such practices." Xavier was silent for a long moment, turning his cup in his hands. "I've seen good people destroyed by men like Thornton. My father was a miner in Colorado. When he died in a cave-in, the company claimed he owed them for tools, housing, even the blasting powder that killed him. Left my mother with nothing but debt." "I'm sorry," Clara said softly. "What happened to her?" She took in washing, ironically enough. His mouth twisted. "Worked herself to death within 2 years. I was 14, about Daniel's age now. How did you survive?" "Worked cattle drives, saved every penny, learned every aspect of ranching I could." Xavier's eyes met hers. "And promised myself I'd never let anyone work themselves to death if I could prevent it." The pieces began to fall into place for Clara, his reaction to her bleeding hands, his immediate offer of employment, his careful treatment of all his workers. "That's why you interfered that day at the creek," she said. "You saw your mother in me." Xavier set down his cup. "At first, perhaps." But that's not why I've kept you on. Why have you then? Because you're the most capable person I've ever met. His voice was low, intense. You transformed this house in weeks. The men eat better, work better. The accounts are finally making sense. And you've done it all without complaint, despite coming here as a stranger. Clara felt warmth spread through her at his praise. It's been a fair arrangement. We both benefit. Xavier leaned forward, and in the lamplight his face was all planes and shadows. Is that all this is to you? An arrangement, Clara's heart stuttered. What else would it be? For a moment she thought he might reach for her hand, cross the invisible line they'd both carefully respected. Instead he stood abruptly. It's late. You should rest. Those accounts will wait until morning. Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving her confused and oddly bereft. Spring came to the Rockingham with a riot of wildflowers across the hills and new calves in the pastures. Clara's days grew longer with garden work added to her household duties, but she welcomed the chance to be outdoors after the harsh winter. Daniel had become an integral part of the ranch operation, showing a natural talent for working with horses that impressed even veteran hands like Hank. Clara's relationship with Xavier remained complicated, warm conversations over evening meals, shared laughter at the antics of a particularly stubborn calf, lingering glances when he thought she wasn't looking. Yet always, that careful distance remained, as though an invisible barrier stood between them. One afternoon in late April, Clara was picking early lettuce in the kitchen garden when the sound of approaching hooves drew her attention. A wagon came into view, driven by a man she didn't recognize, with a woman seated beside him. Clara straightened, brushing soil from her apron as the wagon pulled into the yard. The woman was elegantly dressed in a traveling suit of deep blue, her blonde hair arranged fashionably beneath a small hat. She surveyed the ranch with an appraising eye before her gaze landed on Clara. "Hello there," she called. "Is this the Rockingham?" "Yes, madam," Clara replied, approaching the wagon. "May I help you? I'm looking for Xavier Blackwell." The woman's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm Olivia Pearson, an old friend from Denver." Something in the way she emphasized friend made Clara's stomach tighten. "Mr. Blackwell is out with the men moving cattle today. He should return by evening. How unfortunate." Olivia sighed dramatically. "We've come all this way. I suppose we'll have to wait." Clara had no choice but to invite them in, acutely aware of her work dress and soil-stained hands as she led the elegant visitor into the parlor. Olivia removed her gloves, examining the room with barely concealed disappointment. "Xavier wrote that he'd purchased a substantial property," she remarked. "I expected something more refined." "The ranch is quite substantial," Clara replied evenly. 5,000 acres with excellent water rights. The house itself is comfortable if not luxurious." Olivia arched a perfectly shaped eyebrow. "And you are?" "Clara Fletcher. I manage the household and accounts." "A housekeeper who handles accounts. How unusual." Olivia's tone suggested it was unusual in the way a two-headed calf was unusual, a curiosity but not a desirable one. Clara offered refreshments, which Olivia accepted with the air of someone humoring a child. As she served tea, Clara found herself subjected to a series of questions that felt more like an interrogation. How long had she worked for Xavier? Were there other women at the ranch? Did Xavier entertain often? By the time Xavier returned late that afternoon, Clara had developed a profound dislike for Olivia Pearson. The feeling appeared mutual. Xavier's surprise at finding visitors was evident, though he recovered quickly, greeting Olivia with polite warmth but none of the enthusiasm of a man reunited with someone special. "Olivia, this is unexpected," he said, removing his hat. "What brings you to Utah?" Why, you do, of course. Olivia offered her cheek for a kiss, which Xavier delivered with visible reluctance. After your last letter, I simply had to see this grand ranch you've acquired. Xavier's eyes flicked to Clara, who stood quietly by the parlor door. Clara, would you mind seeing to dinner? It seems we have guests tonight. Clara nodded and retreated to the kitchen, oddly hurt by his dismissal yet unwilling to examine why. As she prepared the evening meal, snatches of conversation drifted from the parlor mentions of mutual acquaintances in Denver, Olivia's father's banking business, some shared history that excluded Clara entirely. During dinner, Olivia dominated the conversation, regaling the table with stories of Denver society that clearly made the ranch hands uncomfortable. She addressed most of her remarks to Xavier, occasionally including Daniel or Hank, but largely ignored Clara except to make veiled criticisms disguised as compliments. This meal is surprisingly adequate, considering the limitations of a ranch kitchen, she observed, delicately cutting her roast beef. Though in Denver, we would serve this with a red wine reduction. Clara bit her tongue, reminding herself that Olivia was a guest, no matter how unwelcome. After the meal, Xavier pulled Clara aside in the hallway. I apologize for Olivia's manner, he said quietly. She can be difficult. She's your guest, Clara replied stiffly. No apology necessary. Xavier ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Clara had come to recognize as a sign of frustration. She invited herself. I never expected her to actually come to Utah. You seem to have a history. Our families were acquainted in Denver. Her father and mine did business together before the mining accident. She seems to think your relationship was more significant, Clara observed, keeping her voice neutral despite the jealousy curling in her stomach. Xavier's expression darkened. Olivia has always had certain expectations that I've never encouraged. She's the daughter of a wealthy banker. I was a penniless orphan when we met. And now I own a ranch that's finally starting to prosper, thanks largely to your management. His eyes softened. Clara, Olivia's presence changes nothing about our arrangement. Again, that careful distance. Clara nodded, stepping back. Of course not. If you'll excuse me, I have dishes to attend to. Olivia stayed for 3 days, during which Clara found herself increasingly relegated to the background of ranch life. Xavier was polite but distant, spending most of his time entertaining his guests or showing them the property. Clara told herself it didn't matter. Xavier was her employer, nothing more, despite the growing feelings she tried to deny. On the morning of Olivia's departure, Clara was hanging laundry when she overheard voices from the side of the house. Curiosity got the better of her and she moved closer, keeping out of sight behind a sheet. You're being ridiculous, Xavier, Olivia was saying, her voice sharp with frustration. This ranch is a fine investment, but you can't seriously intend to live here permanently. Father can arrange a partnership in the bank. We could be married by Christmas. I've never given you reason to believe I had marriage in mind, Olivia. Xavier's voice was firm but gentle. I'm building something here, something that matters to me. A cattle ranch in the middle of nowhere. With that, laundress playing at being a lady of the house. Clara's cheeks burned at the contempt in Olivia's voice. Clara is worth 10 of your Denver socialites, Xavier replied, a dangerous edge to his words. She works harder, complains less, and actually contributes something of value to the world. Oh, I see. Olivia's voice turned knowing. You're infatuated with her. How predictable, the wealthy rancher and his servant girl. She's not a servant, she's what? What is she to you, Xavier? There was a long pause, during which Clara held her breath. She's important to me, Xavier finally said. More important than I realized until you arrived and made comparisons inevitable. You'll regret this, Olivia hissed. When you tire of playing cowboy and want to return to civilization, don't expect my father's doors to remain open. I'll take that chance. Clara heard footsteps storming away and quickly resumed hanging laundry, her heart pounding. Minutes later, Xavier rounded the corner, stopping short when he saw her. "Clara," he said, sounding uncertain. "How long have you been out here?" "Long enough," she admitted, unable to meet his eyes. Xavier stepped closer. "Then you heard." "I heard you defend me." Clara finally looked up at him. "Thank you for that. I meant every word." He took another step forward. Clara, the sound of a wagon being prepared interrupted whatever he had been about to say. Xavier glanced toward the front of the house, conflict evident on his face. "You should see your guests off," Clara said quietly. "It's the proper thing to do." Xavier nodded reluctantly. "We'll talk later, of course." But that conversation never happened. By the time Olivia and her companion departed, a messenger had arrived from a neighboring ranch with news of cattle rustlers in the area. Xavier was forced to ride out immediately with Hank and two of the hands, leaving Clara with only a hastily spoken promise to return as soon as possible. Days passed with no word. Clara tried to focus on her duties, but worry gnawed at her. Daniel, who had remained behind to guard the ranch with Miguel and Lily, assured her that Xavier was experienced and careful. "He's probably just tracking them, gathering evidence," Daniel said. "He wouldn't risk a confrontation without the law involved." Clara wanted to believe him, but as 1 week stretched into 2, fear replaced worry. She found herself standing on the porch each evening, scanning the horizon for riders, praying for Xavier's safe return. It was nearly 3 weeks after his departure when Clara woke to the sound of horses in the yard. She rushed downstairs, not bothering with a robe over her nightdress, and flung open the front door to find Xavier dismounting slowly, his movements stiff with exhaustion. "You're back," she breathed, relief making her knees weak. Xavier looked up, his face haggard but breaking into a smile at the sight of her. "Clara." She hurried down the steps, propriety forgotten in her joy at seeing him safe. Xavier met her halfway across the yard and, without hesitation, pulled her into his arms. Clara returned his embrace, feeling the solid warmth of him, alive and whole. "I was so worried," she whispered against his chest. "I'm sorry." His voice rumbled beneath her ear. "We had to follow them all the way to the territorial border, then wait for the marshal." Clara pulled back enough to look up at his face, noticing for the first time the bruise on his jaw and the cut above his eye. "You're hurt." "It's nothing. The rustlers didn't surrender peacefully." His arms tightened around her. "All I could think about was getting back to you." The words hung between them, charged with meaning. Clara was suddenly acutely aware of her inappropriate state of dress, of Xavier's men watching from a discreet distance, of the impropriety of their embrace. "I should," she began, stepping back. Xavier caught her hands, keeping her close. "Clara, before I left after Olivia's visit, there was something I wanted to tell you." Clara's heart raced. "Yes. Working alongside you these past months, watching you transform this place into a home." He paused, his blue eyes earnest in the early morning light. "I realized that what I feel for you goes far beyond gratitude or admiration." Clara held her breath, scarcely daring to believe what she was hearing. "I love you, Clara Fletcher," Xavier said simply. "I think I have since the moment I saw you working with bleeding hands by that creek, too stubborn to quit despite your pain." Tears sprang to Clara's eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've been fighting it, telling myself you were my employer, that it wasn't proper, damn propriety," Xavier growled, and then his mouth was on hers, warm and insistent. Clara melted into the kiss, her hands sliding up to his shoulders as his arms encircled her waist. A whoop from the direction of the bunkhouse reminded them they weren't alone. They broke apart, Clara blushing furiously as Xavier glared at his grinning men. "I think we've given them enough of a show for one morning," he murmured, his eyes still on hers. "Quite enough," Clara agreed, though she couldn't stop smiling. "You should rest. You look exhausted." "I am," Xavier admitted, "but there's one more thing I need to do first." To Clara's astonishment, he sank to one knee before her, still holding her hands. "Clara Fletcher, you've made this ranch a home and brought light back into my life. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Clara's vision blurred with tears. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, I will." Xavier stood and kissed her again, more gently this time. Behind them, the ranch hands applauded and whistled, joined by Daniel, who had emerged from the house in his nightclothes. "About time," Hank called, his weathered face split by a grin. "Now maybe you can stop mooning over each other and we can get some work done around here." Xavier laughed, wrapping an arm around Clara's shoulders. "Give a man a break, Hank. I just got engaged." Clara leaned into his embrace, happiness washing through her like a cleansing rain. From washerwoman to rancher's wife, it was more than she could have dreamed on that cold day by the creek when a stranger had noticed her bleeding hands and decided she deserved better. Xavier and Clara were married 2 months later in a simple ceremony at the Rockingham. The ranch hands built an arbor festooned with wildflowers, and neighbors from miles around attended, curious to see the woman who had captured the heart of the mysterious Xavier Blackwell. Clara wore a dress of ivory silk that Xavier had ordered from Salt Lake City, carrying a bouquet of prairie roses. Daniel gave her away, his young face solemn with pride as he placed her hand in Xavier's. The local minister performed the ceremony, his words nearly drowned out by the lowing of cattle and the occasional whinny from the corral. Clara thought it perfectly fitting this was a working ranch after all, and their love had been born amid its daily rhythms. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister concluded. "You may kiss your bride." Xavier's kiss was tender and reverent, a promise of the life they would build together. As they turned to face their guests as Mr. and Mrs. Blackwell, Clara caught sight of a familiar figure at the back of the gathering, Mr. Thornton, standing stiffly in his Sunday best, his expression unreadable. "Did you invite him?" she whispered to Xavier. "No," Xavier replied, following her gaze, "but I'm not surprised he came. He's probably trying to assess if this marriage affects his business interests." Clara squeezed his hand. "It doesn't matter. Nothing can spoil today." The celebration continued into the evening, with a feast prepared by Clara and the neighboring ranch wives. Music from a fiddler brought in from Marysville, and dancing in the yard under strings of lanterns. Clara danced with Xavier, with Daniel, with Hank, and even with shy Miguel, who blushed fiercely throughout. As the night grew late, Xavier led Clara away from the revelry toward the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property. In the moonlight, the water gleamed silver, and the air was sweet with sage and juniper. "Happy?" Xavier asked, drawing her close. "Completely." Clara rested her head against his shoulder. "Though I still can't quite believe it's real. 6 months ago I was washing laundry with bleeding hands, and now you're the mistress of the Rockingham." Xavier kissed the top of her head. "And I'm the luckiest man in Utah territory." "We both got lucky that day," Clara mused. "If you hadn't come along when you did." "I believe some things are meant to be," Xavier said softly. "I wasn't planning to ride by the creek that afternoon. Something just drew me there." Clara looked up at him, moonlight silvering his features. "Do you really believe that we were destined to meet?" "I believe a man makes his own destiny," Xavier replied thoughtfully. "But sometimes Fate gives him a nudge in the right direction. They returned to the house late, after the last guests had departed and the hands had retreated to the bunkhouse. Daniel, now officially the ranch's apprentice foreman, had moved into quarters above the stable, giving the newlyweds privacy in the main house. Their first night as husband and wife was tender and passionate, a joining that felt to Clara like coming home. In Xavier's arms, she found a love she had never dared to hope for, and in her, he found healing for old wounds neither had realized still bled. Over the following months, the Rocking M prospered under their joint management. Clara's careful accounting and Xavier's ranching knowledge proved a powerful combination. They expanded their herd, improved the breeding stock, and built a reputation for fair dealing throughout the territory. Clara continued to manage the household, but now hired help a young widow from Marysvale who was grateful for the work and the room for her small daughter. Clara took particular satisfaction in paying the woman a fair wage and ensuring her hands never bled from overwork. Winter came again, but this time, Clara faced it from the warmth of a loving home, surrounded by people who valued her. On Christmas Eve, as they sat before the fire after dinner, Clara placed Xavier's hand on her still flat stomach. "I have a gift for you," she said softly. "One that won't arrive until summer." Xavier's expression transformed from confusion to wonder as understanding dawned. "A baby, you're certain?" Clara nodded, her eyes bright with happy tears. "Dr. Simmons confirmed it yesterday when I went to town." Xavier gathered her in his arms, his joy radiating from him in waves. "A child," he whispered against her hair. "Our child." "The first of many, I hope," Clara replied, her heart so full it might burst. Later that night, as Xavier slept beside her, Clara lay awake, marveling at the journey that had brought her here. From a creek bank with bleeding hands to the warm bed of a man who cherished her, from poverty and exploitation to prosperity and respect. She thought of the words Xavier had spoken that pivotal day. "You're done working for anyone but yourself." He had been right, though not in the way either of them had imagined. In finding love, Clara had found herself her strength, her worth, her capacity for happiness. She was Xavier's partner in all things, his equal in decision-making, his better half in life. As their child grew within her, Clara felt a sense of completeness she had never known before. The Rocking M wasn't just a ranch. It was the foundation of a legacy they would build together, one day at a time, with love and determination. Outside, snow fell softly over the sleeping ranch, covering the land in a blanket of pristine white. Inside, Clara Fletcher Blackwell closed her eyes, her hand intertwined with her husband's, and dreamed of the future, a future bright with promise, secure in love, and built on the strength they'd found in each other. Summer arrived with its customary heat, turning the hills around the Rocking M golden with ripening grass. Clara's pregnancy progressed without complications, though the increasing size of her belly made her daily tasks more challenging. Xavier insisted she rest more and delegate household duties, but Clara was determined to remain active until the baby came. "The doctor said moderate activity is beneficial," she reminded Xavier one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "And I'm not made for sitting idle." Xavier placed his hand on her rounded stomach, smiling as he felt the baby kick. "Stubborn, just like his mother." "Or her father," Clara countered, covering his hand with hers. "And why are you so certain it's a boy? Just a feeling." Xavier's expression softened. "Though I'd be equally happy with a daughter, especially if she has your spirit." Clara leaned against him, content in these quiet moments they shared at day's end. The ranch had fallen into a pleasant rhythm, Xavier managing the cattle and lands, Clara overseeing the household and finances. Daniel coming into his own as a skilled horseman and respected ranch hand. Even Mr. Thornton had grudgingly begun treating them with a semblance of respect in town, acknowledging that the Rocking M was becoming one of the most prosperous operations in the area. As her due date approached, Xavier insisted on bringing a midwife to stay at the ranch. Mrs. Halloran was a no-nonsense Irishwoman from Salt Lake City, with 20 years' experience delivering babies and a reassuring confidence that put Clara at ease. "This one's positioned perfectly," she declared after examining Clara. "Strong heartbeat, good size. You'll have an easy time of it, mark my words." Clara wasn't entirely convinced her mother had died in childbirth with what would have been her third child, a fact she hadn't shared with Xavier for fear of worrying him. But Mrs. Halloran's certainty was comforting nonetheless. The pains began on a stifling July afternoon while Clara was instructing their new cook on preserving peaches. At first, she dismissed them as the false contractions she'd experienced several times in recent weeks. By evening, however, there was no denying that her labor had truly begun. Xavier was beside himself with worry, pacing outside the bedroom door as Mrs. Halloran and Maria, the young widow Clara had hired, prepared the room. Daniel hovered in the hallway, looking terrified, until Hank dragged him off to the bunkhouse with promises of a card game to distract him. "Men are useless at times like these," Mrs. Halloran said cheerfully, shooing Xavier away. "Go boil water or something equally meaningless, Mr. Blackwell. Your wife is in capable hands." The labor progressed steadily through the night. Clara found strength she didn't know she possessed, breathing through the increasingly powerful contractions as Mrs. Halloran coached her. By dawn, she was exhausted but determined, her nightdress soaked with sweat as she pushed when instructed. "That's it, love," Mrs. Halloran encouraged. "The head is crowning. One more good push and you'll meet your baby." Clara summoned her remaining strength, bearing down with a cry that tore from her throat. There was a moment of searing pressure, then blessed release, followed by the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard, the indignant wail of a newborn. "A boy," Mrs. Halloran announced triumphantly. "A fine, strong boy." Tears streamed down Clara's face as the midwife placed the squalling, red-faced infant on her chest. She counted fingers and toes, marveling at the perfection of this tiny being she and Xavier had created. "Let the father in," she whispered to Maria. "Let him see his son." Xavier burst into the room seconds later, his face pale with worry until he saw Clara propped against the pillows, their child in her arms. He approached the bed slowly, as if afraid they might disappear. "Clara," he breathed, sinking to his knees beside her. "You're all right." "I'm wonderful," she assured him, shifting the baby so Xavier could see his face. "Meet your son." Xavier touched the baby's cheek with a trembling finger. "He's perfect," he whispered, awe filling his voice. "You're both perfect, Mrs. Halloran supervised the cleaning up, then tactfully withdrew with Maria, leaving the new family alone. Xavier climbed onto the bed beside Clara, one arm around her shoulders, the other hand resting gently on their son. "What shall we call him?" Clara asked, leaning into Xavier's embrace. "I thought perhaps James, after my father," Xavier suggested. "Unless you'd prefer to name him for yours." "James feels right," Clara decided. "James Daniel Blackwell." "Daniel will be pleased," Xavier said with a smile. "He's been pacing the yard like an expectant father himself." Clara laughed softly, then winced as the movement pulled at her sore body. Xavier immediately looked concerned, but she shook her head. "I'm fine, just tired. It's been a long night." Xavier pressed a kiss to her temple. "Rest then. Both of you, I'll keep watch." Clara closed her eyes, secure in Xavier's arms with their son nestled against her heart. The journey from that creek bank with bleeding hands to this moment of perfect joy had been unpredictable and sometimes difficult, but every step had led her home. James thrived, a good-natured baby with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined chin. Clara recovered quickly from the birth, resuming most of her duties within weeks, though now with James strapped to her chest or napping nearby. The ranch hands became unlikely nursemaids, each vying for the chance to hold the youngest Blackwell when Clara needed her hands free. Daniel proved to be an adoring uncle, spending his rare free time fashioning wooden toys for his nephew. Even Hank, gruff and weathered by decades on the range, could be caught making ridiculous faces at the baby when he thought no one was looking. As James approached his first birthday, the Rocking M hosted a gathering that brought together neighboring ranchers, townspeople from Marysville, and even a few visitors from as far as Salt Lake City. The ranch had become known not only for its quality cattle, but also for the hospitality of its mistress, and invitations to the Blackwells' home were coveted. "You've created quite a community here," Xavier observed as they watched their guests enjoying the barbecue and music. James was being passed from admirer to admirer, clearly enjoying the attention. "We created it together," Clara corrected, slipping her arm through his. "Remember that day by the creek? I never dreamed then that life could hold so much happiness." Xavier covered her hand with his. "I knew you were special from the moment I saw you. Those bleeding hands, that stubborn determination. I wanted to protect you, but you didn't really need protection. You needed opportunity." "And partnership," Clara added softly. "I needed you." Their moment was interrupted by Daniel, now 19, and carrying himself with the confidence of a man who knew his worth. "Xavier, Clara, there's someone here to see you. A visitor from Denver." Clara tensed slightly, memories of Olivia's visit still uncomfortable. But the woman who approached them was not Olivia Pearson. "Mrs. Halloran said I might find you here," the woman said, her voice hesitant. She was perhaps 50, elegantly dressed but with a simplicity that spoke of good taste rather than ostentation. "I'm Margaret Pearson, Olivia's mother." Xavier stepped forward, his manner cautious but polite. "Mrs. Pearson, this is unexpected. Is Olivia with you?" "No." Margaret Pearson glanced around at the festive gathering. "She's in Boston now, married to a shipping magnate. It suits her better than Utah would have." Clara relaxed slightly, relieved that Olivia wasn't about to make another appearance. "Would you care for refreshments, Mrs. Pearson? It's a warm day." "Thank you, Mrs. Blackwell." Margaret accepted a glass of lemonade from a passing tray. "I won't take much of your time. I wanted to deliver this in person." She handed Xavier an envelope. He opened it, his expression changing from confusion to disbelief as he read the contents. "This is a bank draft for a considerable sum," he said, looking up at Margaret. "I don't understand." "It's what my husband owed your father," Margaret explained quietly, "for the mine investment. Harold always claimed the debt was settled when your father died, but I recently found documentation proving otherwise." Xavier stared at the draft, then at Margaret. "You've come all this way to repay a 20-year-old debt." "To do what's right," Margaret corrected. "Harold died last winter. In going through his papers, I discovered many discrepancies. This is one I could rectify." Clara watched emotions play across Xavier's face: surprise, gratitude, and a hint of the old pain that surfaced whenever his parents were mentioned. "Thank you," Xavier finally said. "This is unexpected but appreciated." "I understand you have a son," Margaret said, her eyes softening. "I'd like to see him, if I may, to know that something good came from all of this." Clara nodded to Daniel, who went to retrieve James from his admirers. When he returned with the boy, Margaret's face lit up. "He has your eyes," she told Xavier, "and something of your father's smile." She reached out tentatively, and James, always friendly, went willingly into her arms. "He's beautiful," Margaret said softly. "I never had a grandson, Olivia." She trailed off, then squared her shoulders. "Well, perhaps someday." She stayed for the remainder of the celebration, gradually relaxing in the informal atmosphere of the ranch. By the time she departed for Salt Lake City the following day, Clara felt she understood Xavier's past a little better. Margaret had been caught in her husband's schemes just as Xavier's father had been, though with a more fortunate outcome. That night, after James was asleep and the house quiet, Xavier and Clara sat on the porch swing, watching lightning flicker in distant clouds. "What will you do with the money?" Clara asked. Xavier was silent for a moment. "I thought we might establish a school," he said finally. "A proper one, here on the ranch at first, but eventually in town. For all children, not just those who can afford tuition." Clara squeezed his hand, touched by his desire to create something lasting from his parents' tragedy. "I think that's a wonderful idea. Education was so important to my father, too. And we'll need a trust for James and any other children we might have." Xavier glanced at her, a question in his eyes. Clara smiled. "I've been meaning to tell you. Dr. Simmons confirmed it last week. James will have a brother or sister by winter." Xavier gathered her close, his joy as intense as it had been the first time. "Another child," he marveled. "Our family is growing." "As is our legacy," Clara added, resting her head on his shoulder. "Not bad for a laundress and a cowboy who met by chance." Xavier chuckled. "There was nothing chance about it. I told you before, some things are meant to be." As the years passed, the Rocking M flourished, as did the Blackwell family. A daughter, Elizabeth, joined James, followed 2 years later by twins, Thomas and Sarah. The school Xavier and Clara established became the pride of the community, eventually moving to a purpose-built building in Marysville, where children of all backgrounds received an education that emphasized both practical skills and academic knowledge. Clara never forgot her days working at the creek with bleeding hands. She established a foundation that provided interest-free loans to women seeking to start businesses or acquire skills, determined that no one in their community would ever be as trapped as she had been. When Mr. Thornton finally retired, his general store was purchased by one of Clara's first loan recipients, a young widow who transformed it into a thriving mercantile. Daniel married Maria's younger sister, who had come to work at the ranch after hearing of the good treatment employees received there. They built a house on the eastern edge of the property and started their own family, with Daniel eventually taking over as foreman when Hank retired. Xavier, true to his word that first day, never allowed anyone at the Rocking M to work until their health suffered. The ranch became known as a fair employer, and positions there were coveted. Some of the practices, the Blackwells instituted reasonable working hours, fair wages. Decent housing for workers gradually spread to other ranches in the territory, as their success demonstrated that treating people well was good for business as well as morally right. On their 20th anniversary, Xavier surprised Clara with a trip to San Francisco, a city she had always wanted to visit. Their children were old enough now to manage without them for a few weeks, with James, at 19, showing every sign of becoming as capable a rancher as his father. As they stood on the deck of the steamship watching the city recede, Xavier wrapped his arms around Clara from behind, his chest warm against her back. "Happy?" he asked, echoing the question he had asked on their wedding night. Clara turned in his embrace, studying the face that had become as familiar to her as her own, the lines at the corners of his eyes deeper now, silver threading through his dark hair, but those blue eyes still as intense as the day they met. "Completely," she answered, just as she had then. more so than I ever dreamed possible. Even though your hands still get dirty and your work never really ends." Xavier teased gently. Clara laughed, linking her fingers with his. "But I work for myself now and for our family, our community. That makes all the difference." "You've built something remarkable, Clara," Xavier said, his voice serious now. "The ranch, the school, the foundation, they all bear your imprint." "We built it together," Clara corrected him. "Everything good in my life began the day you stopped by that creek and saw a woman with bleeding hands instead of just another laundress." Xavier brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch as tender as it had been when they were young. "I saw you," he said simply. "I still see you. And I fall in love with you a little more each day." As the ship carried them toward new horizons, Clara reflected on the journey they had shared. From that fateful day by the creek to this moment of mature love and shared accomplishment, their path had been one of growth, challenge, and profound joy. The bleeding hands that had once symbolized her captivity had become capable hands that built a legacy, raised children, and reached out to others in need. And through it all, Xavier had been her partner, her champion, her love. The cowboy who had said, "You're done working for anyone but yourself," had given her not just freedom but the greatest gift of all, a life filled with purpose and love, a home where her heart could truly flourish. Together, they had transformed what might have been a brief encounter into a lifetime of meaning. And in the end, that was the truest measure of love, not grand gestures or passionate declarations, but the patient building of something enduring day by day, hand in hand. As night fell over the Pacific and stars emerged above them, Clara and Xavier Blackwell stood together at the ship's rail, their faces turned toward the future, their hearts secure in the knowledge that whatever lay ahead, they would face it as they had faced everything in the 20 years since they met together.